Chapter 5. That little Arliss, if he wasn't a mess. From the time he had grown up big enough to get out of the cabin, he'd made a practice of trying to catch and keep every living thing that ran, flew, jumped, or crawled. Every night before Ma let him go to bed, she made Arliss empty his pockets of whatever he had captured during the day. Generally, it'd be a tangled up mess of grasshoppers and worms and praying bugs and little rusty tree lizards. One time he brought in a horned toad that got so mad and he swelled out round and flat as a Mexican tortilla and bled out of the eyes. Sometimes it was stuffed like a young bird that had fallen out of a nest before it could fly, or a green speckled tree frog or a striped water snake. And once he turned out of his pocket a wadded up baby copperhead that nearly threw Ma into spasms. We never did figure out why the snake hadn't bit him, but Ma took no more chances on snakes. She switched Arliss hard for catching that snake, and then she made me spend better than a week taking him out and teaching him how to throw rocks and kill snakes. Well, that was all right with little Arliss. If Ma wanted him to kill his snakes first, he'd kill 'em, but that didn't keep him from sticking them in his pockets along with everything else he captured that day. The snakes might be stinking by the time Ma called on him to empty his pockets, but at least they'd be dead. And then, after the other dog came, little Arliss started catching even bigger things, like cottontail rabbits and chaparral birds and a baby possum that slolled and lay like dead for the first several hours until he finally decided that Arliss wasn't going to hurt him. Of course, it was Old Yeller that was doing the catching. He'd run the game down and then turn it over to little Arliss, and then our little Arliss would come in and tell Ma a big fib about how he caught it himself. I watched them one day when they caught a blue catfish out of Bird Song Creek. The fish had fed out in the water so shallow that his top fin was sticking out, and about the time I saw it, Old Yeller and little Arliss did too. They made a run for it, and the fish went scooting away towards deeper water, only Yeller was too fast for him. He pounced on the fish and shut his big mouth down on it and come romping onto the bank, where he dropped it in the grass and let her flop. And here little Arliss fell on it like I guessed he'd been doing on everything else. The minute he got his hands on it, the fish finned him up good and he went to crying. But he wouldn't turn that darn fish loose. He just grabbed it up, went running and squalling towards the house where he gave the fish to Ma. His hands were all bloody by then, when the fish had finned him up. They swelled up and got mighty sore, and not even a mesquite thorn hurt as bad as a sharp fish fin when it come deep into your hand. But as soon as Ma had wrapped his hands up in a poultice of mashed up prickly pear root to draw out the poison, little Arliss forgot all about his hurt. And that night, when we ate the fish for supper, he told the biggest windy I ever heard about how we dived way down deep into a deep old hole under the rocks and then dragged that fish out, nearly drowned before he could swim to the bank with it. But when I tried to tell Ma what really happened, she wouldn't let me. "Now this is Arliss's story," she said. "You let him tell it the way he wants to." Well, I told Ma then. I said, "Ma, that Old Yeller dog is going to make the biggest liar in Texas out of little Arliss." But Ma, she just laughed at me like she always laughed at little Arliss's big windies after she'd gotten off where he couldn't hear her. She said for me to let little Arliss alone. She said that if he ever told a bigger whopper than the ones I used to tell, she has yet to hear it. Well, I hushed up then. If Ma wanted little Arliss to grow up to be the biggest liar in Texas, I guess it wasn't none of my business. All of which, I figure, is what led up to little Arliss's catching of the bear. I think Ma had let him tell so many a big yarn about catching live game that he begun to believe it himself. And when it happened, I was down at the crick a ways, splitting rails to fix up the yard fence where the bulls had torn her down. I'd been down there since dinner, working in a stand of tall, slim post oaks, and I'd chopped one down, trimmed off the branches as far as I wanted, and then cut away the top of the tree. After that, I'd start splitting the log. I'd split the log by driving steel wedges into the wood, and I'd start at the big end and hammer in a wedge with the backside of my axe. This would start a little split running lengthwise down the log. Then I'd take a second wedge and drive it into this split. This would split the log further along and at the same time loosen the first wedge, and then I'd knock the first wedge loose and move it up in front of the second. Driving one wedge ahead of the other like that, I could finally split a log in two halves. And then I'd go to work on the halves and splitting them apart. That way, from each log, I'd come out with 4 rails. Swinging that chopping axe was sure hard work. The sweat was pouring off me, and my back muscles ached. The axe got so heavy I could hardly swing it. My breath got harder and harder to breathe. An hour before sundown, I was worn down to a nub. It seemed like I couldn't hit another lick. Pa, he could have lasted till past sundown, but I didn't see how I could. I shouldered my axe and started towards the cabin, trying to think of some excuse to tell Mama to keep her from knowing that I was played clear out. And that's when I heard little Arliss scream. Well, little Arliss, he was a screamer by nature. He'd scream when he was happy and scream when he was mad, and scream a lot of times. He'd just scream to hear himself make a noise. Generally, we paid no mind to this screaming more than we did a gobble of a wild turkey, but this time was different. The second I heard his screaming, I felt my heart flop clear over. This time I knew that little Arliss was in some real trouble. I tore up the trail leading towards the cabin. A minute before, I'd been so tuckered out with my rail splitting that I wouldn't have struck a trot, but now I raced through them tall trees at that creek bottom, covered in ground like a scared wolf. Little Arliss let out a second scream, and when it came, it was louder and shriller and more frantic sounding than the first. And mixed with it was a whimpering, crying sound that I knew didn't come from him. It was a sound I had heard before, and seemed like I ought to know what it was, but right then I couldn't place it. And then from way off on one side came a sound that I'd recognize anywhere. It was the coughing roar of a charging bear. I had just heard it once before in my life, and that was the time that Ma had shot and wounded a hog-killing bear, and Pa had had to finish it off with a knife to keep it from getting at her. My heart went to pushing up into my throat, nearly choking off my wind. I strained for every lick of speed that I could get out of my running legs, and I didn't know what sort of fix little Arliss had gotten himself into, but I knew that it had to do with a mad bear, and that was more than enough. The way the late sun slanted through the trees had the trail all cross-banded with streaks of bright light and dark shade. I ran through those bright and dark patches so fast that the change in light nearly blinded me. And then suddenly I ran out into the open where I could see ahead. And what I saw sent a chill clear down to the marrow of my bones. There was little Arliss, down in that spring hole again. He was laying half in and half out of the water, holding on to the hind leg of a little black bear cub no bigger than a small coon. The bear cub was out on the bank a-whimpering and a-crying and clawing at the rocks with all 3 of his other feet, trying to pull away. But little Arliss was holding on for all he was worth, scared now and screaming his fool head off, too scared to let go. How come that bear cub ever prowled close enough for little Arliss to grab him, I could never figure. And why he didn't turn on him and bite loose I couldn't figure out either, unless he was just like little Arliss, too scared to think. But all that didn't matter now. What mattered was that the bear's cub mama, and she had heard the cries of her baby and was coming to save him. She was coming so fast that she had the brush popping and breaking as she crashed through and over it, and I could see her black, heavy figure piled up down the slant on the far side of Birdsong Creek, and she was roaring mad and ready to kill. And worst of all, I could see that I'd never get there in time. Ma couldn't either. She'd heard Arliss too, and here she come from the cabin, running down the slant towards the spring, screaming at Arliss, telling him to turn that bear cub loose. But little Arliss wouldn't do none of that. All he'd do was hang on to that hind leg and let out one shrill shriek after another as fast as he could suck in breath. And now the she-bear was charging across the shallows in the creek. She was knocking sheets of water high up into the bright sun, charging with her fur up and her long bared teeth, filling the canyon with that awful cough and roar. No matter how fast Mama ran or how fast I ran, the she-bear was going to get there first. I think I nearly went blind then, picturing what was going to happen to little Arliss. I know that I opened my mouth to scream, and not a single peep come out. Just then, as the bear was lunging up the creek bank toward little Arliss and her cub, a flash of yellow came streaking out of the brush. It was that big yeller dog. He was roaring like a mad bull. He wasn't 1/3 as big or heavy as that she-bear, but when he piled into her from one side, he rolled her clear off her feet, and they went down in a wild, roaring tangle of twisting bodies and scrambling feet and slashing fangs. And as I raced past them, I saw the bear lunge up to stand on her hind feet like a man while she clawed at the body of that yeller dog that was hanging at her throat. I didn't wait to see any more. Without even checking my stride, I ran in, jerked little Arliss loose from the cub, and I grabbed him by the wrist and yanked him up out of the water and slung him towards Ma like he was a half-empty sack of corn. I screamed at Ma, "Get him, Ma! Get him and run!" And then I swung my chopping axe high and wheeled, aiming to cave that she-bear's head in with the first lick. But I never did strike. I didn't need to. Old Yeller hadn't let that bear get close enough. He couldn't handle her, for she was too big and strong for that. She'd stand there on her hind feet, hunching over, taking a roaring swing at him with one of those big front claws, and she'd slapped him head over heels. She'd knocked him so far that it didn't look like he could possibly get back there before she charged again, but he always did. He'd hit the ground rolling, yelling his head off with the blow of the pain, but somehow he'd always roll to his feet, and here he'd come again, ready to tie into her with another round. I stood there with my axe raised, watching them for a long moment, and then from up towards the house I heard Ma calling, "Come away from there, Travis! Hurry! Run, son!" Well, that spooked me. Up till then I'd been ready to tie into that bear myself, and now suddenly I was scared out of my wits again, and I went running for the cabin. But, like as it was, Old Yeller nearly beat me there. I didn't see it, of course, but Ma said that the minute Old Yeller saw that we were all in the clear and out of danger, he threw the fight to that she-bear and lit out for the house. The bear chased him for a little piece, but at the rate Old Yeller was leaving her behind, Mama said it looked like the bear was backing up. But if the big yeller dog was scared or hurt in any way when he came dashing into the house, he didn't show it. He sure didn't show it like we all did. Little Arliss was hushing up his screaming, but he was trembling all over and clinging to Ma like he'd never let her go. And Ma was sitting in the middle of the floor, holding him up close and crying like she'd never stop. And me, I was close to crying myself. Old Yeller, though, all he did was come bounding in to jump on us and lick us in the face and bark so loud there inside the cabin the noise nearly made us deaf. The way he acted, you might have thought that the bear fight hadn't taken anything more than a rowdy romp that we'd all taken part of just for fun. End of chapter 5.